Next start. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anthony Brown, the chair of the APPG on the environment, and it's a great honour to have Lord Deben, John Selwyn Gummer, the chair of the Climate Change Committee. The Climate Change Committee, as everyone knows, is the statutory committee to advise the government on the actions needed to tackle climate change and to meet our now legal target of getting to net zero by 2050. They recently published their sixth carbon budget, showing that although the UK has had good reductions in emissions in the past, that was all easy wins, and we need to do radical action to make sure we meet the net zero target in 2050. The CCC also publishes a climate change risk assessment. They've just done their third one, and also it publishes progress reports to Parliament about adaptation as well as the reductions. In fact, they were published last week. Lord Deben has agreed to say a few words and obviously take questions and answers. Normally the most interesting part. Normal rules apply to these, so do please put yourself on mute if you're not talking. We've got a few pre-submitted questions, but otherwise, if you want to ask a question, please just mention it in the chat or stick up the yellow hand so I can see you and get you to ask questions. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lord Deben, if you could brief us on the sixth climate change budget, but also your recent progress reports to Parliament and the risk assessment.
Well, thank you very much. There has been a huge amount of work, and first of all, the sixth carbon budget it has been recognised internationally as the most fundamentally worked and detailed route to net zero, because by the time we get to the end of it, we'll be within striking distance of 2050, and therefore if we haven't got it right by then, we'll not be meeting our requirements. So it is a crucial budget and the most important one which we have done, and a great deal of work went into it, and it has been internationally recognized as so. And what it really says, first of all, is that the cost of delivering net zero is in fact less than 1% of the gross national product. And if one wants to put that into some context, it means that if you look forward as to where you think the GNP would be in 2050, we'll be 4 months later than we would have been if we hadn't spent that money. So it does show, and that's based upon the principle of being extremely conservative of the advantages and very conservative in sense of overstating them of the costs. So I think we can genuinely say that what we have to do for the sixth carbon budget is what we would probably have to do anyway to get out of COVID and to build a new economy based upon the world in which we live. And that is a world which is moving rapidly towards taking net zero as a necessary aim. You've only got to look at the unprincipled heat which is taking place in the United States at this moment, just to see how climate change is beginning to impinge really seriously, even on countries which haven't been frightfully good at understanding what climate change is doing. And so we are increasingly in a world in which most human beings recognize climate change, recognize it's happening, and recognize we've got to do something about it. The sixth budget explains how we do that, and it provides the basis upon which the Prime Minister promised the 68% reduction as the nationally determined contribution by 2030, and the continuation of that to 2035. And it's the basis upon which we will negotiate the 26 COP at the end of the year. But in the meantime, of course, we produced two other reports, and just quickly to refer to them. The first is our assessment of preparedness for climate change. Now, there's always a problem about talking about preparedness, because if you're saying on the one hand, we've got to get down to something below 2 degrees increase, and then you start talking about prepared for what happens if it's 3 degrees, if you're not careful, the one makes the other less credible. But the fact of the matter is that even if we get it to 2 degrees, or even better, when we, I hope, will understand that we should push it down as near to 1.5 as possible, it still means significant change for which we have to prepare. And the main lesson of the document is that the government has frankly done nothing. I mean, the truth is that apart from significant increases in the money to protect ourselves from flooding, it hasn't in any way met its own assessment of what the effects of climate change will be. And that means that, for example, 1 million homes have been built, which are going to have to be retrofitted because of the effect of climate change, leave alone because of preparing to reduce our emissions. And that is because the then government in 2017 was foolish enough to not to uphold the zero carbon homes that had been promised for that, but to put that off. And so a whole lot of people have bought houses, and they are going to have to pay the cost of retrofit when it could have much more easily been done in the building of the house, and the price would have come out of the cost of the land. And we all know that what has really happened is that the house builders have shifted that cost from themselves to the people who bought the houses. So that is the kind of example of what has been happening over the past few years, because we have not been preparing for the heat, and we've not been preparing for the cold, and we've not been preparing for much except the question of flooding. And central to that also is preparation of our land. You will know, Anthony, because we've talked about this before, land use is going to be one of the biggest issues that we are dealing with. It'll be hugely important, not least in order to deal with flooding, not least in order to deal with drought, not least in order to provide the places for people to relax. And we've learned through COVID just how important the natural environment is. We're losing our biodiversity every month. The Dasgupta report very much underlines that. And yet the fact is that DEFRA has no plan for net zero. So the department responsible for adaptation and the department responsible for land use and dealing with biodiversity has actually got no 2050 net zero plan. And I only give you one example of that. We still haven't banned horticultural peat and the importation of horticultural peat. And yet the destruction of our peatlands is one of the ways which you do most to increase climate change. Because as you know, peat in its proper sense draws in and sequestrates carbon. If it becomes damaged, dug up, it does exactly the opposite. It pushes carbon into the atmosphere. So you have a double failure. And we've now got the fairly ludicrous situation of the department spending money on trying to restore peatlands, but not banning the destruction of peatlands, which really doesn't seem to be a sensible operation. And in any case, it has a far too small target for restoration. It only wishes to restore 8% of our peatlands by 2025. And yet, according to the 6th carbon budget, we have to get 100% restored by 2045 if we are to meet our target. So again, the department has frankly not got anywhere like where it ought to be. So the last thing I was going to say was, what does the assessment of this last year say? Well, first of all, it is extremely complementary to the government in the standards and the decisions that it's made about what our target should be, about the Prime Minister's 10 points, about his approach to net zero and to the 26 COP. But what we do have to say is that the connection between that and delivery is, I'm afraid, very poor. There really is a terrible gap in delivery. Most of the things that need to be done have been put off. The promised information, the promised decisions have not been made. And where they have been made, they haven't met the government's own ambition. In other words, it has said it will do X, Y, and Z, but it has known that it has to do more than that in order to achieve its ambition. Now, I want to be able to say something quite different next year. I want to be able to say that this is a mere blip between decision making for the overall and particular delivery for each of the elements. But to be able to do that will mean some very big changes, particularly in DEFRA, particularly in DHMLC, where the promised planning bill has got to have a net zero test, so that everything we do, we ask about net zero and only do those things which are congruent with net zero, either by doing things elsewhere to make up, or at least themselves satisfying a net zero test. And we'll also have to see much more activity and support from a whole range of other ministries. I take one single example. Education is going to be crucial. If we're going to take advantage of the green economy, we've got to have young people trained to be able to do those jobs, to understand the whole question of risk, all sorts of things like that. Yet the Secretary of State for Education has, as far as I know, never made a speech on the question of climate change and education. And yet that has to be a central issue in what we do. So I'm looking forward for this report and its predecessor to really fire the government into action, to use the months between now and COP26 in November to make those changes and those detailed delivery points, so that next year I shall be able to praise it, not just for the standards it set, not just for the targets it's agreed to, but actually for the delivery that it has managed to make.
Great. Well, thank you for that broad overview. And I agree, there's clearly no point in setting targets if you don't actually deliver on them. And I'm sure the government itself would like a more positive report next year. Coming to questions, Lord Cameron would like to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anthony, and thanks, John, for that. You're quite right. For this agenda to succeed, we've got to integrate it into every single aspect of our lives in every department. And I hope that next year you'll be able to give a better report. But my question actually is, next year will be too late for my question, which is about, I'm very worried that in our preparations for the CBD conference, COP15, on trying to improve the horrific loss in biodiversity both the world and the UK has seen. And I think the two agendas, the climate change agenda that we're hosting the conference, is very, that they should be more integrated. And I just wondered what your views were on our seemingly lack of integration of COP15 and COP26, within the government.
Well, it does seem to me absolutely clear that climate change and the battle to reverse the loss of biodiversity are intimately connected and cannot be properly divided. I mean, I like to look at climate change very much from the point of view that the Pope did in Laudato Si, when he said that climate change is the symptom of what we have done to the world. because that puts all these other things, whether they are pollution, whether they are way we've dealt with other people, whether they are about biodiversity, that puts them into the right context. That's the disease. That's what we've got to conquer. That's what we've got to reverse. And so biodiversity is crucial to the future, not least because without maintaining and then enhancing and trying to win back so much of the biodiversity that we have lost and the land use which that will need, we can't meet the net zero requirements. They are absolutely connected like this. And I do think it's, again, one has to come back to the fact that the department responsible for that should be DEFRA. And I have not seen that kind of integrated attitude, nor that preparation for COP26, or indeed the biodiversity COP, which would bring those together.
Thank you. So let's come to Gareth Morgan next, to the Soil Association, who pre-submitted a question. Gareth, I don't know if you want to ask it, and then Tony Lloyd, and then Daniel Zachman. You're on mute, Gareth. You're still on mute. I could. I've got your pre-submitted question, so I'll just read it out. Which was the recent CCC reports highlighted the need for a shift to farming systems that reduce synthetic nitrogen use and increase soil carbon alongside an evolution in diets to less but better meat, especially less grain-fed meat. What can the CCC do to develop integrated approaches to climate-friendly farming, biodiversity recovery and healthier diets without provoking ridiculous tabloid headlines or hostile backbench interventions? Surely not from here. I mean, you've talked about some of the land use stuff, but not the change in diets in particular.
Yeah. Well, the fact is, we have to tell the truth. I mean, the basis of the independence of the Climate Change Committee is that we base what we say entirely on the science. And one of the interesting things is, even with all the funded antagonism to what we do, the one thing nobody has been able to point to is the situation in which we have done other than put forward the issues based on the science. And my predecessor set that up, and I have continued it in a very, very strongly. So we don't make campaigning remarks or bits and things we don't quite know about. We really say what is a very clear reflection of the truth. Now, that leads us to say that we do need a reduction in the amount of meat that we eat, and we have suggested a very limited reduction, as a matter of fact, of 20% in the first instance, rising to 30%. Now, when you compare that with what the health experts say, it is very much less than they say we ought to. And actually, I think most of us recognize that 20% of less eating altogether would not be a bad thing for a very large number of our population, and probably most of us who are on this call. So the 20% reduction is more or less the direction in which we're going already. And if you think of buying better meat instead of quite so much meat, then of course you do end up happily by buying British meat, not only because there is very much of it properly produced, but also because the carbon footprint of British meat is among the lowest in the world. And therefore, this makes sense. But what the government did, and this is a thing that I really do feel sad about, the government produced a statement saying that it was going to accept the 6th carbon budget and present it to Parliament and all the rest, and then added to that in a different typeface. So it clearly was a late addition to this press release, but that doesn't mean we'll do everything that the Climate Change Committee suggests, for example, diet. And really, it's not me that's got to be concerned about what the angry press, and it is the government has got to explain to people, but it's got to do something about diet anyway, because we have a serious epidemic of obesity. And what has COVID shown but the damage of obesity and the fact we're not doing anything effective among young people, particularly children, to start a situation in which the next generation is healthier than the present one. And we know that the lengthening of expectation of life has temporarily been slowed by the fact of human-induced diseases, like, for example, obesity, which simply shortens people's lives, gives them diabetes and the like. So it is an issue that governments have got to seize, and there is no point in ignoring that. And actually what the Climate Change Committee asks for, as I say, is very significantly less than that which those who are concerned with our health would demand. So I make no apologies for it. I go to the other side. I say very clearly, veganism is not the answer to our problems. We need to have cattle and sheep and pigs, and they play a part in the mixed farming that we need. So I'm very much against those who try to hijack the climate change concept for their own interests, which are entirely other. You want to be vegan, do be a vegan, but don't ask me to be it, and certainly don't ask me to be it on the basis of climate change. But we do have to eat less meat, and we do have to eat better meat, and we particularly need to look at pasture-fed meat, because that's part of the good cycle, which has been wonderfully fought by the Soil Association and the organic movement for so long.
Thank you for that impassioned plea about our diets. I can certainly do with eating 20% less. So coming to Tony Lloyd now, and then Daniel Zeichler, and then Sylvie Kruniger, who pre-submitted a question, and then Simon from Beamer. So Tony.
Thanks, Anthony. And John, thanks very much for the work that you have been doing, not just for today. But one of the questions I wanted you to address, if you would, is the issue about how we change attitudes. Government can change policy and lay the foundations for strategy, but we do need to make changes household by household, individual by individual. And the last your last comments on eating habits are a testimony to that. One of the things that the CCT reports don't achieve, and this isn't a criticism of you and yours, is the mass role that we need you to play. So I want to ask really if you've got views on how we can, well, popularize the work you do, because it is so important to begin that education process. The other thing, just a quick addition. Do you have any views on the progress of our neighbours on this planet? Because of course we can have the finest policies, we can have the finest implementation of those policies, but if we are a relatively small community in world terms, it won't solve the climate change issue. We can be an exemplar, but any comments on what we do to make COP26 and beyond the success has got to be. Thanks, Anthony, and thank you, John.
Well, let me try and do that second one first, because it's quicker. I mean, the fact is the world is in a much better place today on that subject than it was a year ago, not least because of President Biden and his acceptance of these matters. The vast majority of industrial nations are now committed to net zero, except for China, in net zero in 2050. The latest news from China on what laws that they are going to change looks extremely encouraging. So there is a very real movement, and one does have to remember that the Paris Agreement is the first time in the world that every nation has signed up to something. And therefore we do know the direction in which it is going. You're quite right, Tony, we can't do it on our own. We have to be an exemplar. We ought to be anyway, because we caused the problem in the first place in the Industrial Revolution. There's no doubt, and we've grown rich by it. And as rich by pollution, I'm afraid there is a price to pay. The fact we put it off is not one that means that we can avoid it. So we do have to do that. But I am happy to say that I'm much more encouraged by what's happening around the world. And my own view is that as climate change becomes more and more obvious, even to the most purblind, I mean, when you've got to raise the streets in Key West, people who've been voting for Republican deniers for years are now beginning to realize what happens if you don't do something about climate change. So there is a huge change that is taking place. Now, as far as you're quite right, we're in this odd position, aren't we, where the general public has come round to a real belief that we've got to do something about climate change. I mean, there's no doubt about that. There's been a significant change. It's also true that the financial world has recognized that ESG in general and fighting climate change is actually an essential part of being here in 20 years' time. So they're not investing in things they think are not taking proper account of climate change. So there has been a very significant change. But we have failed to turn that into something which makes people know what they ought to do, what their contribution could be, how they could benefit from the changes that take place. All that is hidden from people. Now, I'll give you two very quick examples. I have both an electric car and I have a air source heat pump. Buying the electric car, if you have the money, is very easy because there are people out there who want to sell you an electric car and they'll tell you all about it. They'll let you have a go in it and you can make a decision and you buy it. And you know, when you pay the money, the car arrives. That's what happens. You try buying a heat pump. It's the most complicated thing in the world. The whole system has no idea about how you explain to people, how you do it, when you think about a number of houses in this country, I mean, I accept that mine would be difficult because it's a Victorian Gothic house and it's rather complicated. But when you think of all those semi-detached houses of a very similar structure, there must be a package which you could sell to them, which you could explain. And the government must have some system of helping people. The fact that it's failed on the green grants so far doesn't mean that it can't find an answer. So it is a question of information, and it's a question of giving people the chance to do the things they know they want to do that are right, and to do it in a way which brings them in and becomes part of it. I mean, fascinating effect of the great meeting that we had of the public involvement which the government so bravely set up on climate change. And when you look at that, these people who knew nothing about it and who were many of them antagonistic and drawn entirely as a cross section, as they learnt about it and as they argued it, the more they became enthusiastic about it. But we've just got to go out there and do it. You must not assume that people can find it out for themselves. And my last thing, if I'm going to have a little rant, it is, what on earth is the Department of Local Government doing not having a package to help local authorities that want to reach, have agreed to reach net zero? There's no system, there's no local government, there's no kind of partnership between the centre and local government. And local government is essential to deliver all this. And the thing I wish we could just get over is, there is no wonder Cumbria made the choice that it did originally on the question of the Cumbrian coal mine. There's no access to any information. Not only is there no planning system which tells them they've got to do that, and that's the thing we've got to change, but there's no part of the department which would give them that information and that advice. So there's a huge amount to do, and I'm very pleased you raised it.
Well, thanks for that impassioned plea. Giving lots of food for thought here. Daniel Zeichner next.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks, John, and your committee for telling it as it is, which I think is very, very welcome. One thing struck me recently. I was reading Dean Helms's latest book, Net Zero, and he's quite influential on government thinking. And he makes the point that really we've concentrated on carbon production, but really it's carbon consumption that matters. And when you look at that, it does seem like we're exporting a lot of our problems elsewhere. And change in government trade policy isn't a risk that's only going to get worse. Now, whatever we're doing here, and we are in danger of making the problem worse rather than better.
Well, I think that the facts don't really support that argument. I think there is a very significant argument to say that we've got to make sure that they don't, but that is a different issue. I mean, we do look all the time at our consumption emissions as well as our production emissions. But you, Daniel, know better than most that the reason we are all based on production emissions is that this is the only way in the United Nations that you can do it, because otherwise you'd have double counting. And also these are the only emissions over which you have direct control. And so you have got to, that's the way you have to do the comparison. But we produce the consumption emission figures regularly, and we shall do it even more regularly in the future. This last 18 months has been a very peculiar one because of COVID. So it's a bit difficult to know whether there's any change, but actually overall, our consumption emissions have been declining. Of course, the international demand constantly to reduce emissions elsewhere should mean that that will continue. What's more important is that as the financial world has taken seriously these matters, importers, big companies selling goods, whether they're supermarkets or whether they're sports businesses or whatever else they are too looking at the carbon content of the products which they're selling. And we've just got to get better at doing that. And of course, the TCFD arrangements, which will mean that people have to report much more in much greater detail, all that will help, and we need to pressurize in that way. And so my feeling about Dieter's position is that he's absolutely right to make us remember this all the time. I don't think that the problem that he adumbrates is actually going to get worse, but we've got to make sure that it doesn't. And one of the ways we've got to do that is to be much better at labeling so that people know whether they are buying something which has been properly made or not properly made. And this is going to be very important. The last thing is governments have got to recognize that this is part of their trade policy. Their trade policy really cannot be run on the basis that you ignore these matters. And I'm pleased to see someone who I haven't always agreed with, Grayling in the House of Commons has been saying that this is about trading with Brazil. As long as Brazil cuts down the trees in the rainforests, we really can't have trading agreements which actually are based in helping them, because that's what happens if you do that. And similarly, I feel strongly about the Australian trade agreement, because it doesn't seem to me to meet the promise made by the government, which was that we would expect farmers in Britain to meet the highest standards of safety, welfare, and environmental protection. And none of that is built into the arrangements with Australia, which in 15 years' time, as far as I can see, can export whatever they like to the United Kingdom, whether it meets those standards or not. That is not to fulfill the promise that was made, nor, if I may say so, is it going to make it possible to meet net zero, not least because Australia is a country which does have standards much less strong than our own, and secondly, is a country which is not contributing in any way its strengths towards the battle against climate change.
So we're going to come to Sylvie Krooniger, but before that, just following up what you were saying there, do you support border carbon adjustment payments, which the government is now thinking about and certainly having discussions with other countries, and the EU and Joe Biden have both supported?
Well, I think in the end that it's almost an inevitable thing, because it's going to be like the way in which sensible countries deal with all sorts of other things, like whether it's animal welfare or safety. I mean, we have a sort of a border adjustment for safety, don't we? If you produce unsafe goods, you can't export them. Well, maybe if it's going to cost money to do things, and it will, then I don't mind the Australians exporting things, but it seems to me that you need to have some sort of adjustment, or you have rules which they have to meet, and they can choose which they like, maybe. And one of the sadnesses of Brexit is that it has mucked up our ability to look at these things objectively, because there's always in the back of people's minds, is this going to do this or that because of the Brexit situation? And I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about the whole thing, of course, but I'm sorry about that in particular, because it makes it more difficult to try to be logical in how you deal with this. And it may be that it's a mixture of things between regulation and taxation.
So it certainly creates a bigger political imperative to get trade deals. Sylvie Kruniger, I hope I pronounced your name right.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to ask about mechanisms that might be employed in the future or that might be on the horizon to ensure major infrastructure decisions are aligned to the net zero agenda.
Well, we have said that, if I get your question right, we have said in the Climate Change Committee that there ought to be a very clear test on any decision that is made by government, on government procurement, and of course on any planning decision. And that test we have suggested very clearly. We've again produced some answers for the ministries concerned, and that test should be very much parallel to the test which the Chancellor has already insisted that the Bank of England does in its decisions. And it is a bit odd, isn't it, if you have the Bank of England making these decisions with that test and the Department of Local Government in making its decisions on planning not. So I see that, but not just for big infrastructure issues. This really matters locally. It matters that that's the way we think of two houses down the road. That's the matter where how we think about sustainable drainage, how we think about access to electricity. It's how we think about flooding and floodplains, all those things. We have to do these. We have to be sensible and rational about it rather than rush at things and leave ourselves with a bill which we need not have paid.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. I'm now coming to Simon Harpin from BEMA, which is, if you could just explain what BEMA is as well. I know you're a trade association of some sort.
We are, yes, thank you. Representing manufacturers of products largely for buildings and electricity networks. So thank you for the comment a couple of minutes ago about heat pump supply chain and how those products are sold. We represent manufacturers of heat pumps, so yeah, share that frustration, I think. Secondly, curious, Lord Deben, on what you think has been holding government back. I sort of read the CCC reports, and the policy recommendations are detailed by department and consistent at the very least over the last couple of years, and in many cases going back. So is it just that this is still seen as a long-term problem and therefore kind of struggles to get the immediate investment where there's other shorter-term priorities? Is it a lack of input from or knowledge or resource among policymakers? Can industry do more, or is it something else that's holding back government when there's a lot of good recommendations from yourselves?
Well, I think one of the problems is just simply that government never has been very good at delivery compared with making policy decisions. It's much easier to say this is what I want to do than actually get down to show how you're going to do it. I mean, I'm afraid that's a universal thing, and it's true of all political parties. I mean, it's a point which I always remember Tony Blair made at the beginning of his second governing period. He said, when we started, we thought if we said something, it would happen. We discovered it didn't happen at all. You know, it's really quite, we just have to accept that all governments have found that difficult. So I think we ought to start there. Secondly, I do think that for a long time, quite a number of departments didn't think it was anything to do with them. They thought this was something that Bayes and DEFRA were supposed to do, and frankly didn't do the things that needed to be done. I think that has changed considerably, and what the Ministry of Defence is now doing is very, very good, and it's exemplary steps, very good. But on the other hand, what DEFRA is doing isn't very good. You know, there's a difference between the and certainly I think we've really got to relearn what we mean about regulation. I mean, I've never understood why people, particularly on the right, don't accept that if you want to have motor cars, you have to decide which side of the road they drive on. And you have to make that a rule. Otherwise, you can't run motor cars. It's part of running motor cars. Now, similarly, if you want to do something about climate change, you have to raise the standards, for example, of electrical all the electrical gadgets of one sort and another. Now, that has been done. To a large extent. It's not good enough yet. We have to go on doing it, but it has been done. And the result of that is that people's electricity bills are lower today than they were. And that's even though the price of electricity has risen. The reason they're lower is that the equipment they use is very, very much more energy efficient. I mean, you will remember, Simon, even at your age, you will remember when a television set which was on standby was using half the electricity that it would be if it were fully on. Now it uses hardly any at all. It's a very small example, but it's a huge effect when those things happen. If you think how much more efficient a properly arranged boiler is now from what it would be 10 years ago, you see what the difference is. But that is regulation and enforcement. And I am afraid that we have cut back on enforcement enormously. So even where we have the right regulations, I mean, just one single fact, which I think is outrage. The Environment Agency in 2010 had a grant of £110 million. This last year was £40 million. They have a bigger job, they have more things to do, and we think they can do it on something like a third of what they did do then, less than a third if you think about inflation in the meantime. The fact is, you can't have proper regulation if you don't have proper enforcement. And that is true about our house building. You know from your members that not every house that is built that claims to meet our present standards actually does that, because the enforcement is practically nil, and because the whole system of measurement doesn't make sure that it is even as good as the low standards we have today. So I think one of the problems is we have to relearn that good regulation is good for you all. Your members want to have a standard you can all stick to, because that means that you have fair competition. If you don't have that, then you have unfair competition, and cowboys and crooks undersell the decent people, and that drags the whole thing down. So we've got to learn that good capitalism demands good regulation. And if I may say so, Anthony, conservatives should be, of all people, the people who are most concerned with good regulation, because it's only that that makes sure you have good competition and you don't have competition which drives everything to the bottom.
Well, I fully agree with that. And as I used to be chair of the government's regulatory policy committee, and our whole focus was better regulation. Absolutely, you need. I used to be chief executive of the British Bankers Association, always arguing you need really strong regulation of financial services to ensure they work in the public interest. I'm going to be slightly provocative here, and I apologise in advance. But I've just been sent a tweet that Nick Timothy, Theresa May's former advisor, tweeted earlier this week. I don't know if you saw it, but he sort of threw down the gauntlet to you slightly, saying the Climate Change Committee thinks it's above democracy. It's set net zero targets with fancy plans to meet them, and now berates ministers for taking time to engage with reality. And it unilaterally expands its remit to hold government to account and cover yet more policies. I don't know if you saw that tweet. I'm just wondering how you respond to that.
Well, I don't think the man's ever read the law. I mean, I only do what the law tells me to do. I mean, as usual, it seems to me that he has put his views ahead of the facts. The facts are that the Climate Change Committee acts because of the Climate Change Act. That was passed by Parliament with one of the biggest majorities ever in history. And it was passed by a cross-party vote. It was presented by the opposition Conservative Party, backed by the Liberal Democrats, taken on board by the Labour government, and that is what we do and how we keep it. So first thing to Mr. Timothy is learn the facts. The facts are we are not above the law, we are a servant of the law, created by the law, and what we do is precisely what the law tells us to do. The reason that we set the net zero target in the way we did was at the request of the government, and that was put before Parliament and voted on by Parliament. Nothing that we do counts until Parliament supports it. When Parliament has passed it, then what we do is to help ministers to see how best to achieve that. We cannot force them to take the measures that we ask them to do, but our job is to show them how those measures would add up, so that if they don't want to do A, they have to find something else that will replace it. But it is they who make those decisions. And if Mr. Timothy had bothered to find out the facts, he would recognize that his tweet, which I have seen before, has no foundation in facts of any kind whatsoever. And I only hope that his advice to a previous Prime Minister was based more sensibly than that tweet.
Thank you for that very robust defence of your position there. I think, and you're right. There is, one thing that struck me since being elected is how strong the political consensus is in terms of tackling climate change. And I think I'm right in saying that the 78% reduction target by 2035 wasn't opposed by a single MP of any party. We've got about 10 more minutes if anybody's got other questions, but I've got one that you at the beginning when you're talking about the progress report to Parliament on adaptation. You mentioned you focused quite heavily on the only adaptation they've done was on flooding, which is obviously true, and that's politically quite sensitive. What are the other areas of adaptation you think the government should do as opposed to mitigation which you said they haven't been doing?
Well, the fundamental area is about housing and construction, because everything you build is going to be there for a long time. And therefore, getting those regulations right and getting them enforced is crucially important. And that's, of course, still being held up. They said it was going to be 2025 for the future homes standards. Then they brought it back to 2024 for about 12 hours, and it then went back to 2025 in another of those rather embarrassing moments when there was a sort of mix-up. But the fact is, if we're not careful, if we don't get these things out quickly, whether it's 2024 or 2025, what will happen will be the house builders will say, you haven't got enough time, given us enough time to do what we need to do. The longer you leave it, the more that is a credible statement, although I'm afraid house builders always do say that, even if they've got plenty of time. But this has to be done, and that to me is the most important one. But the other bigger thing about adaptation, which seems to be so obvious, we are going to deal with climate change primarily by taking the carbon out of our generation system. And yet there is no government policy for the systemized system of the electricity delivery. We're not looking at the system at all. And so all sorts of bits and pieces are being done, but there is no overall system decisions. So we won't be able to do it unless those changes are made. And therefore, as far as adaptation is concerned, we know they're going to be hotter weather. We know they're going to be colder weather. We know we're going to have to use a lot more electricity in order to protect ourselves in those circumstances. But the electricity system needs to be overhauled very widely. For example, just simply bringing offshore wind onshore, not on a sort of Dad's Army way, of little bits of string between each of them, but a proper ring main and properly doing it. All that needs to be done, and yet there is no policy to do that, and Ofgem does not have the powers to do that. Indeed, Ofgem is in many ways restricted from doing what it ought to do on this front, and it knows it.
Great. Can I just come back to COP26, which obviously you touched on earlier? You mentioned that there was a lot of a lot more support amongst other countries now for the whole climate change agenda, and obviously new president in the United States, and you mentioned China, that they've got some more interesting and ambitious proposals about reaching net zero by 2060. What do you think will happen with COP26, or at least what do you think the government needs to do to make sure that it is a big success? And what would you define success as? Just reaching, presumably more than just reaching any agreement, you'd want a particularly strong agreement. So what is success for COP26, and what do you think the government needs to do to actually get it?
Well, I do think this delivery business is most important. But what we really will need the net zero delivery plan strategy, which has been promised, and we'll need that well in advance, and we'll need side by side with that the promised Treasury statement about financing it and making it a just transition. Those two things must come together, and they need to come well in advance, because only that will make people believe the promises that we've made, or our nationally determined contribution that we've put forward. If they can't see that it's going to be done, if they can't see the mechanisms for doing it, then I think they will be much more reticent in bringing it back. The second thing that has to happen is that the government, and the Prime Minister in particular, needs to spend some real time with particular individuals, helping them to come to some real terms. Australia is one of those. If we're having these discussions with Australia, Australia really is the outlier now that Canada has come on board, and the United States and South Korea and Japan. What on earth are we doing with these circumstances, with Australia being so much behind and still talking language which really has got nothing to do with 2021? So there are individual things that I think that the Prime Minister will need to spend time on. And then lastly, to make it a success, I think we will need to be very, very really aware of our biggest problem, which is that we will only get this world problem, this global problem, solved in a global way. And the developing nations have got to be helped to move from where they are now to a decent standard of living without going through the pollution on the way. You know, it's rather like the mobile phone is now very widespread in Africa. They haven't gone through the fixed line situation. They've jumped the technology. We've got to help them do that. We are committed to do so, but that money has not been as noticeably arriving as the promises were made. And this government has a real responsibility to make sure that that happens, is seen to happen, and it gives confidence to the developing nations to join in on all this. Now, to do that, of course, it has already done a good thing, which is that it has ring-fenced its own contribution on climate change. And our contribution on climate change is significantly more generous than many others. The bad thing that it did, of course, was to do the cut from 0.7 to 0.5% for overseas aid. I mean, I think that, I have to say to them, this is not as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, it's me. I think that is immoral. I think it's a deeply offensive thing when you're in a hole to shove somebody in a deeper hole, even deeper in their hole. So I find that really unacceptable. But even if I didn't think that, the truth is, if you want people to be convinced that you really do stand by your promises, and you don't stand by a very similar promise which was in your election manifesto, you've got quite an uphill task to do to make them understand that in the future. So now we're in that position. The government's got to work very hard if people are going to believe that they're going to get the help they need to have, and which we need to give to them if we're going to win this battle.
Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left. I'll just, unless anybody else sort of quickly waves their hands and asks a question, I'm going to just the very last question is you've slapped the government's wrist quite firmly about not taking various bits of action, but clearly quite a lot of the policies are politically slightly more difficult. Things like heating, for example. You mentioned the trouble with heat pumps, and there's some concern about the costs of that, for example. And you talked about diet earlier, and obviously that's a sort of a sensitive issue, and it's certainly how the media tends to respond to it. I'm just wondering if there are any, what you see as the lowest hanging fruit in terms of what the government should do in tackling climate change, and are there any things that are sort of easier that you really can't understand why the government isn't moving ahead?
Well, I think an awful lot of these things are actually, it just depends how you look at them. Look, when last did the government have the support of the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, and the Sun in doing these things? I mean, it really has a public acceptance out there. So let's go back. Setting higher standards for homes is really easy. You do it, and you will find that the house builders will meet it, and the public will understand how good that is. They've had a huge success, the government, in putting money into local authorities for the work for energy efficiency in local authority and housing association buildings. They put another $500 million into that when their own green proposition obviously wasn't working. They can do a lot more down that route, and they will find that with local authorities will really deliver. There's some very good local authorities, undistinguished by their party, if I may say so. I mean, if I wanted to make a list of them, they'd start with two, with the very good, my own local county council in Suffolk, a Conservative controlled one, and Leeds City Council, Labour controlled. They're all over the country. There are local authorities who can really deliver. And if you look at the mayoral elections, interestingly, those mayors who were known to be deliverers won, irrespective of their party, which is also an interesting point. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in local authorities which we could do. Changes in the Planning Act will be very welcome and will certainly be very possible the government can do that. And my last one that is relatively simple for the government is that because there are all those people outside there who want to, I think it can get much more help from business. Business wants this to happen. And if we can show that we are prepared to do what business needs, I think business will help to give the government the opportunities and also stand behind much tougher regulation, which business wants, because that's the way they believe they can deliver.
Well, great. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. I'm just going to finish reading a comment from Alison, which you probably won't have seen in the chat, but this is by far the best APPG I have been fortunate enough to attend. Polite, straight talking from Lord Deben. Wonderful to hear such clarity and focus on delivery and action. What are we waiting for? Indeed, and hopefully if we have you back next year and in your next year's report, you'll be able to say more supportive things about the delivery of reaching net zero by 2050. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you. And thank you everyone else for attending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.